All right, good to have everyone with us tonight, and we're glad for your attendance, and we hope that our Bible study is beneficial to all of us. We are beginning the 12th chapter of Acts tonight, and so let's go ahead and open our Bibles to the 12th chapter of Acts, and we'll read verse 1. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. Now we remember that just before this in chapter 11, we were told that there was going to be a great famine throughout all of the land, and during Claudius's reign, I pointed out that there were 4 famines. 3 of them were not in Judea, but one of them was, and that's the one that is under discussion here. And once the collection is all taken up, then Paul is going to deliver it, Paul and Barnabas, to Jerusalem, to the elders. And let us also remember that it wasn't something that happened immediately at this time, because they're going to travel throughout the Grecian world, and they're going to be taking up a collection all along the way. And it's going to be brought back, and when it gets back to Antioch, then they'll take it to Jerusalem. So this is going to be for a while, and the famine hasn't started yet. So they're doing this in preparation for that time. There are a number of references to that in different books of the New Testament. Corinthians is one of them, etc. So we see that at that time that this prophecy was made by Agabus. Now we ask the question, who was the Herod of this passage? You know, there were a number of Herods. Herod named some of his sons after himself, Herod this and Herod that, and just a number of names that are given. This would have been Herod Agrippa the first. There were more than one Herod Agrippas, but this was Herod Agrippa the first. He was the grandson of Herod the Great. Now, we are more familiar, at least in the early stages of the New Testament, with Herod the Great. He's the one who ordered all the babies killed in Bethlehem and in the region around Bethlehem, what we might call suburbs or something of that nature. He was the son of Aristobulus and Bernice, again, relatives of Herod the Great. And he was raised with Caligula. Now, if you study any bit of Roman history, both Caligula and Claudius, whom he was raised with, these men, this doesn't mean that he was raised at the same time they were, or it's talking about actually raised with these people. He was in close contact with Caligula and Claudius. And when we think about that, it can help us to understand why he was so evil. This man was an evil man. Herod the Great, his father, he was an extremely, or Herod the Great, his grandfather, I think it is. I'll get it right in a minute, maybe. But he was an extremely evil man. And here, Herod Agrippa the first had been raised with Caligula and Claudius. Their influence would have been tremendous. These events now that we see in chapter 12, the beginning of chapter 12, these events happened about 10 years after the death of Jesus. So we're looking at a period of 10 years. Remember, in that time frame, Paul would have, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe Paul would have become a member of the church about 2 years after the death of Jesus. I think that's right. About 2 years. I'm saying about. And so then Paul went into the desert region for 3 years where he was taught everything he needed to know, and then he went back to Jerusalem. So we're talking about 6 years. That means that if my math is right, Paul would have been in Tarsus for about 3.5 years, if my math is right. And so that's where Barnabas went to get him, to help him in the work. So this is the first recorded instance now of Christians being persecuted by civil authorities. And that's what we're looking at in this chapter. Before this time, it was always by religious authorities. The church was suffering in Judea, but it wasn't because of the government persecuting them at that time, at the beginning. It was the religious leaders, members of the Sanhedrin, who most of them came from that religious body of Sadducees. Remember, the Sadducees pretty much ruled the temple, both in representatives, because they ended up coming mostly from the priestly class, and they were in the majority in what we call the Sanhedrin. So before this time, it was religious authorities. Starting with chapter 12, we see the first recorded instance of civil authorities becoming involved in persecutions. And the reason that Herod got involved in this was because he was trying to gain the favor of the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees, we remember, were those in opposition to the Sadducees, the Herodian group, and so we're looking at politics here. And Herod was trying to gain the favor of the Pharisees, who hated Christianity, who wanted to destroy it, just like Paul had previously tried to do. So look at verse 2 and 3. Here's what Herod did. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And because it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. And so we see that Herod had murdered James with a sword, had him murdered or executed, I guess probably would be the better word, and yet it was murder. There was no reason to kill James. He wasn't an insurrectionist. He was one of the apostles of the Lord. It probably means that he was beheaded when it talks about killed him with a sword. That was usually the manner in which many prisoners were executed if they weren't so bad that they had to crucify them. Crucifixion was considered the execution of the worst of the criminals. It's interesting when you study all about the crucifixion. There are a lot of things about it that are interesting to me, at least. Only the worst of criminals could be crucified, and no Roman citizen could be crucified unless he was guilty of treason. If he was guilty of treason, he could be crucified. But any other crime that he committed that called for death, he could not be crucified for it. So this, when it talks about the sword, it's probably a beheading of James. So why did Peter, and remember somebody else very famous in the Bible was beheaded? Who was that? John the Immerser. So how did Herod arrest Peter? His murder of James emboldened him. It made him feel that, hey, this is something that pleases a lot of people, and so especially the Jewish leadership, again, Sanhedrin, and the temple priest. So I'll see if I can't make them even happier. I'll put on a persecution against these Jews. McGarvey well understood, I believe, the truth in this matter. He made this statement. He said, "A man engaged in a wicked enterprise," listen to what he's saying now. "A man engaged in a wicked enterprise is often made timid by conscience when left to himself." Well, we understand that, don't we? But then he goes on to say, "But when applauded by the multitude, he is emboldened to press forward in this mad career." Now, let's liken that to today. Is a person, or usually even two or three, emboldened to go out and rush into a store and steal things off the shelves? But what happens when you get a dozen or more that are saying, "Yeah, let's do this"? then everybody gets a lot bolder and they accomplish it. So that's what he basically is saying about this. You know, these riots that we've seen on the street, where they go down the streets and they burn buildings and tip over cars and set them on fire and break all the windows in the stores and all that. That didn't start with because one guy said, "Hey, look, No, he convinced others, and once they got this mob mentality about them, then they're willing to do it. Herod obviously intended to murder Peter. There can be no doubt about it, because when he murdered James, it emboldened him, and now he says, "Oh, this pleased them, so I'll do more." And no doubt he intended to murder Peter. Well, the question then would be, when did Herod arrest Peter? And the text tells us it was at the time of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, one of the great Jewish holidays that all males were supposed to come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And this gives us a clue as to why Peter was not immediately executed. They would not have executed him during the feast, while the feast was going on. They're going to have to do it some other time, because if they had murdered him in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or if it had been the time of Pentecost, or any of these great feast days, the people would have risen up in just tremendous anger. So even though they wanted to execute him, doing that during the feast would have infuriated. Man, what's wrong with my tongue? The Pharisees. So the feast, remember, as we study from Exodus chapter 12, would last for 7 days. And that brings us to verse 4. And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers, to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. First of all, what's a quaternion of soldiers? Well, a quaternion of soldiers would be 16 people divided into groups of 4. And what that would do was allow 4 of them to guard the prisoner for a time, whatever time was set, and then the other 4 would come and relieve them, and they would take over guarding a prisoner. So a quaternion would be 16 people divided into groups, quads, of 4 each. So a group of 4 quaternions, 16 soldiers. Why did Herod guard Peter with so many soldiers? I mean, stop and think about this. He obviously would have put him in chains. He obviously would have put him in a prison. Why would he want so many soldiers guarding Peter? Maybe he remembered what took place in Acts chapter 5. In verse 17, you remember the apostles had been arrested, and they had been placed in a holding cell, at the very least, a prison that when most people would think of, and the apostles had been freed by an angel. Maybe he was remembering that. So he didn't want a repeat of that kind of a thing. He didn't want them just disappearing. Remember, when the apostles were let loose by the angel, there had only been 2 guards at the door. And yet, when they were questioned, they had no idea what had happened. None whatsoever. So it may be that he didn't want a repeat of what he knew had already taken place in the past. Now, looking ahead, we'll see that 2 soldiers were chained to Peter in the cell. If we look ahead in the text, the context, we see that 2 soldiers were chained to Peter. And chains make a lot of noise, don't they, if they're moved? Even if you turn just a little bit and move your arm just a little bit, it would have made a noise. And very possibly have even pulled on the person you were chained to. Now, let's think about that chaining. It's believed by most scholars that I've read from, not all of them, but a good majority of them, that he was chained one on either side, and chains were hooked to his wrist and his ankles. And what that would have done was, with a soldier on each side, he may be able to somehow strike one of them, but he can't do both. And more than likely, he couldn't even reach the other one, because by the time he started pulling it this way, he would have jerked the arm of the guard on this side of him, who's going to instantly wake up. When did he intend to murder Peter? Well, notice the text says that he intended after Easter to bring him forth to the people. It is sad that the word Easter is found in the text here, because the original is not Easter. The reason that it is Easter is because the men that King James hired, and there were a large, I forget how many of them. Do you remember how many,
No.
William? It was a large number. It was over 100. And they were under penalty of death if they mistranslated anything. So there were a number of cases in the Bible where they transposed letters from the Greek and made basically a new word, but it signified what the old word meant, but without translate. For instance, baptizo. We get our word baptized from baptizo. What happened was the Greek letters were brought down into their equivalent of the English, and that's where the word baptized comes from. Well, something similar happened right here. In fact, they did mistranslate this. But why did they do it? Because King James loved Easter. He liked that as a celebration. See, this celebration, this festival, was held for many years before King James had the Bible translated into the English. And he loved Easter. Why did they bring the word baptize out of baptizo? Because King James believed in sprinkling. See, and baptizo doesn't mean sprinkling. It's an immersion. And so in order to gain favor with King James, here, instead of translating the word Easter, Passover, the Hebrew or the Greek word is Pascha, Passover. They translated it Easter. It's the right time of the year, but it's the wrong designation. Catholicism introduced the celebration of Easter as a special celebration day. They knew that it was the Passover, but they tried to change a lot of things, and they did change a lot of things, and this was one that they, instead of celebrating Passover, the Catholics introduced celebrating Easter in its place. But it's the same time of the year. That's why you'll notice that the English designation Easter, if you notice on your calendars, never falls on the same day. In the Hebrew calendar it does, but in the Christian calendar it's not the same. It may be Monday this year, it may be Friday next year, or it can even be a week difference at times. So early Christians never celebrated one specific day as the resurrection of Jesus. Christians didn't have to do that. They knew they had a risen Lord, and they weren't commanded to do it. We aren't commanded to do it in the New Testament. Christians have always celebrated Jesus' resurrection when? Every first day of the week. That's when we celebrate and we don't do it once a year. We do it 52 or 53 times a year, depending on how the calendar falls as far as Sundays. Did y'all get that? Sometimes we have 53 Sundays in a year. I didn't check the calendar this year to see if this year is one of those, but that is the case. And we're commanded to do so in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We see the celebration of his death, burial, and resurrection. And I might add, his coming again is also to be considered when we do this. Till I come, the text says. You celebrate the first day of the week, the Lord's Supper. Now, let's consider that the Passover was celebrated as a reminder to the Jews of their deliverance from Egyptian bondage. It had absolutely nothing to do with Christ. It had nothing to do with his death, burial, and resurrection. The Passover was celebrated specifically to remind the Jews of their deliverance from Egyptian bondage. Now we go back in time, and what do we see? Well, when the time came, we remember there were 9 plagues that came upon Egypt, and after every single one of those plagues, the Egyptians refused to let the people go. And then God said there's going to be one more. You didn't pay attention during these 9. You won't allow your hearts to be softened. You won't allow your hearts to see the truth that it's more than just coincidence. It's more than just anything a human being. So I'm going to send one more, the 10th plague. And we remember that God sent an angel. We sometimes call him the angel of death. I'm not sure that's really the way we ought to approach it. But the angel was sent out, and his purpose was going to be to kill all of the firstborn of the Egyptians, or anyone who did not have the blood of the Passover lamb on the doorpost of their house and on the lintel. Anyone who partook of the Passover lamb and its blood was used on the doorpost and lintels, this angel would pass over their house. They would be spared. The firstborn would not die as long as they remained in the house. Now, there are a lot of things we could look at with regard to that. As long as we're in the church, as we ought to be, living as God wants to, the second death passes over us. We won't suffer the second death that Revelation talks about. And so this was to be a reminder. The Passover feast was a reminder to them that God had passed over and allowed their firstborn to live. Christians, we celebrate the Lord's Day because it was the day that Jesus rose from the dead. Christians celebrate the first day of the week. We don't celebrate Passover. That's a Jewish feast day. Had a totally different meaning. Well, let's think about this question. How long was Peter imprisoned this time? Now remember, he'd been with the apostles before in Acts 5 when they were in prison. Now he individually has been cast into prison. Well, how long was he in there? Well, at least a day, possibly as many as 7. Now, we need to remember something about a day and the way the Jews looked at a day. A day to us is 24 hours in our time. Not so in the Jewish way of looking at time. Their day could be 1 hour. It could be 11 hours. It could be 24 hours. We also need to remember that in that time, the lowest increment of time was an hour. They didn't have seconds and all of that stuff like we do today. You remember Paul said, no, not for an hour. They didn't subject themselves to the false teachers. No, not for an hour. At least a day, possibly 7. So in our way of thinking about that, it could have been 6 days and 2 hours. Or it could have been 5 days and 11 hours, depending on how they looked at time. And that brings us to verse 5, where Peter, therefore, was kept in prison, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God, unto God for him. So what were the brethren praying for? Well, we probably would assume, first of all, they're praying for Peter's release. That would be an obvious assumption, wouldn't it? Consider what happened to James. Peter's release was probably not expected. Why? Because James had been locked. Do you think the brethren wouldn't have been praying for James's release when he was taken into custody? Well, obviously they would have. And they're praying the same thing for Peter. But now James was not released. He was killed. His head cut off, probably. So they probably are praying hard, and they might have been just a little apprehensive, thinking, this is probably going to happen to Peter too, but we're still going to pray for him. Who knows what God will decide to do? Were they praying for strength for Peter? You know, we don't think about that one too much, do we? As we look into the Scriptures, how often do we see prayers that were prayed for strength to accomplish the will of God? Paul especially, we see that with in the letters to Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy. He asked the brethren to pray for him, that he would have the courage, the strength to proclaim the truth of God's Word. His death, were they praying that his death would glorify God? How do we pray, with regard to whenever that time is that we won't be here anymore? Do we pray for strength to be able to endure? I think we probably do, don't we? Were they praying, "Thy will be done"? I think there's a good chance that they were praying that too. Leave the problem in God's hand. How many times, William, do you and I urge people to take our problems, and we're all going to face them. We all have problems. Take it to God and let Him take care of it. We should take our problems to God and let Him handle it in the best way. That doesn't mean that we sit back and we just do nothing. If there's something we can do, we've got to do it. But sometimes we don't know the correct thing to do. We may think it's something else. We may choose the wrong path to follow, thinking that this will take care of the situation, but that's not what God had in mind. Roper said Herod had closed the doors to the prison, but he could not close the door to heaven. I believe that you and I will consider all of these avenues of prayer if we have any indication that our death is coming soon. How did the brethren pray for Peter? Now, we're not told the words. We don't know what words they used, but notice what the text says: without ceasing. Continuously, without stopping. They were constantly praying at this time, specifically this time, for Peter. Probably in all the areas that we examined just a few moments ago. Remember what James told us? What the Holy Spirit through James said? The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. I've always been fascinated with that passage. The effectual, the efficient, fervent, with all of our being. That prayer of a righteous man is worth a whole lot. It's worth a multitude of blessings. I also see a little irony here. Herod planned Peter's death. There can be no doubt about that. He was planning to kill Peter. But instead, Peter outlived him. He died before Peter. I'm going to kill Peter. I killed James, and man, those Pharisees, they loved what I did, and man, I'm going to get their favor, because Herod wasn't liked by the Jews. None of the Herods were. They weren't liked by the Jews at all. Almost all of them broke their Jewish religion, as they claimed to be part of the Jewish religion. Almost all of them were extremely evil men. All of them were evil, but in the way we judge things, most of them were extremely evil. Let's look at verse 6 and 7. And when Herod would have brought him forth, the same night Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and the keepers before the door kept the prison. And behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and a light shined in the prison, and he smote Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, Arise up quickly. And his chains fell off from his hands. When Herod decided the time is right to get Peter out of the prison, to bring him before the people, to execute him, the feast days had ended. The time when he did not dare to murder Peter, that time had ended. Now it's time to execute his plan. And on the same night, we're told that Peter was sleeping between two soldiers. The same night. In other words, Herod made the decision in the nighttime that tomorrow was going to be the day that he took Peter and executed him. What was Peter doing? Ask yourself this question. How many times have you tossed and turned in your bed because of something you thought might happen tomorrow? How many times? We've all done it. How many times has sleep evaded us because there's some problem that we're trying to work out in our minds, and we're trying to say, how is this going to be accomplished? What was Peter doing? He was sleeping. Didn't bother him. I'm sure that the word had gotten to these jail. Tomorrow's the day. Peter probably had known about it too. He knew when the feast days ended. He knew that's why Herod wasn't putting him to death during that time. Here's the day after the feast have ended. He's sound asleep. He's not worrying about a thing. Oh, I wish we could do that, don't you? He's going to be executed tomorrow. In fact, he was sleeping so soundly that when a bright light showed up and lit up the prison, he didn't wake up. In fact, he was so sound asleep, the angel had to kick him. You remember something Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6? Take therefore no thought for the morrow. For the morrow shall take care of the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Take no thought for tomorrow. No anxiety. The original, it deals with the word anxious, anxiety. Don't be anxious about tomorrow. Don't be fearing what's going to come tomorrow. And yet we human beings, we do it way too much, don't we? Notice how that verse ended in verse 34. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. We got enough problems each day of our lives as we're living to avoid the slings and arrows of Satan. We've got enough going on in our days, brought about by events that we may not have any control over at all by others. One day at a time. That's what it's teaching us. Live one day at a time. Don't be anxious about tomorrow. Things will take care of themselves. Notice the New King James Version here. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow. It's the right idea. For tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. That's the idea of what we have in the King James. No sense worrying about tomorrow. It'll take care of itself. What we need to worry about is right now. How are we taking care of things? Peter is sleeping, I guess what we call the contented sleep of the righteous. He knows he hasn't done anything wrong, and he knows that God's in charge, and he knows that God's will is going to take place no matter what. He is literally fulfilling the admonition that Jesus gave in Matthew 6:34. It's not a restless sleep. So sound the angel had to smite him to wake him up. How could he sleep that way? There's only one answer, because he knew he had peace with God. If we have peace with God, we can endure anything. Normally, if a person is chained to a guard, he's going to be chained on both sides where he cannot use his body in any way to attack one of the guards and maybe gain his release. And I would dare say, more than likely, not only was he sleeping between two guards, there were probably the other two guards of the quaternion at the door, outside the door. Peter was chained between those two guards. And notice the angel of the Lord came upon him. And the light shined in the prison. His chains fell off. God's messenger lit up the prison. I don't know about you, but if I'm in a real dark room and somebody comes in and turns the light on, wakes me up, doesn't it you? Not so with Peter. And notice, obviously, God had caused these soldiers to be in such a state of comatose almost that they didn't know what was going on. They didn't realize that the chains had fallen off. Imagine the noise that would have made when the chains fell off. When the door was opened and they left. Notice something about those chains. They were not unlocked. They just fell off. And nothing said about the soldiers' chains falling off of them where they were chained to Peter. The noise didn't wake them up. Can you put yourself in those soldiers' place for a moment? Imagine waking up. When you went to sleep, there was a prisoner between you and the guard on the other side. You were chained to him, and you wake up and you look over, and nobody's there. Only that other guard over there, but there, nobody's there. The chains are just laying there. Just imagine. And that's where we'll pick up next week with verse 8.